this is the Real Crusades History Podcast. I'm J. Stephen Roberts. We've got with us again Dr. Stephen Donnachie. Glad to have Dr. Donnachie with us. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Yeah, it's great to have you as always. So yeah, we're going to look at the Barons' Crusade for this podcast. I'm looking forward to this one too because I feel like I've sort of overlooked the Barons' Crusade in my own private studies of the Crusades. But the interesting thing about it is the Barons' Crusade comes along as we're coming out of the Sixth Crusade. Jerusalem had been recovered by treaty. Frederick II had managed that. And we've really got this period of pretty intense civil war, both for the Crusader states and for the Ayyubids. The Ayyubids being Saladin's dynasty. These are Saladin's heirs, or the heirs to Saladin's brother Al-Adil. Dr. Donnachie, did you want to comment on what things were like in the Ayyubid camp at this point?
Yeah, it's a bit chaotic really in some regards. The 1218, you have Al-Adil, Saladin's brother, dies, and now as a result of the lid is kind of lifted off all of these competing factions and rival Ayyubid princes and dynasts who are competing for control and competing for influence between the various cities and provinces that they've been given or assigned or have managed to take over. And the thing is, we talk of the Ayyubid Empire quite a lot, as it's founded and created under Saladin and then continued under his brother Al-Adil. But really, it's very so much more of a confederation. You have all of these princes and potentates who are all rivaling each other for power and influence and control and prestige. And obviously, the two big sort of pieces of the pie that they want are Egypt, which is of course the richest of all the provinces, and Damascus as well. And so you have this rather chaotic situation that lasts from sort of 1218 through to actually the mid sort of 1240s until it really sort of settles down, where the sons and grandsons and nephews of Saladin and Al-Adil are all competing with each other for control of these different cities. So Damascus and Cairo, Jerusalem change hands several times, change alliances several times between one sibling or one cousin and another, in temporary lived alliances that rise and fall as the situation is required. And Al-Kamil, who's one of these individuals, is quite capable. He manages to try and exert some hegemony over the Ayyubid territories during the 1220s and the mid 1230s, but he then too dies in 1237, and once again everything that he tried to build up is all up for grabs once again between his heirs and his various nephews and cousins and such things again. So you have quite a chaotic situation at this time in sort of the mid to late 1230s, about the time that the Barons' Crusade is sort of taking off. So it's incredibly complex, with all these different cities, all these different princes. And it's quite hard to keep a track of exactly what's going on. So try and keep it quite simple, to be fair, because we could quite easily get lost in just the Ayyubid politics.
Yeah, very true. I feel like every time I've sort of tried to get it all straight in my head, it's always kind of it's changing so much that it's really hard to keep straight.
It seems there always seems to be another Ayyubid relative on the border somewhere who comes in with something or other every other minute. But it is quite a complex subject. But it's also quite integral to how the Crusades, certainly the Barons' Crusade, then ends up playing out.
Yeah, definitely. So now that we've sort of gone over the Ayyubids, what would you say things were like at this point for the Crusader states, in particular, the Kingdom of Acre, as I like to call it, at this point on the eve of the Barons' Crusade?
In some ways, they have a lot of their own sort of problems. In regards to their relationship with their neighbours, the Ayyubids, things are actually pretty good. In this regard, the Ayyubids are far too busy fighting amongst themselves and wasting resources, against their rivals, to really give too much attention to the Crusader states especially along the Palestinian coast. they appear as quite something of a footnote in the Muslim sources of the time. They're not really given much attention because they're not much interest to them at this time. So for the Crusaders, for the Franks of the Latin East, this is it's a very good thing. It keeps them on the sidelines and gives them every opportunity to make good on the sort of recoveries that they've been trying to make since the end of the Third Crusade. And they had some success at this. They'd been able to recapture some cities during the early part of the 13th century. They'd had various crusades, 5th, 6th, for example. 6th of Crusade returned Jerusalem to them, along with various other locations, Bethlehem, Nazareth, for example. So they have ideal opportunities to try and make the best of the situation they've got when they're not being focused on by the much larger Ayyubid world around them. Frederick II in 1229, Sixth Crusade, has a treaty with the Ayyubids that lasts for 10 years. So they're quite good until to have this peace treaty until 1239. And in this time period, Frederick had upset an awful lot of people in the Latin East with his particular stance on particular autocratic stance on how to go about ruling and what he expected and how he expected to act as a king. And he had made a lot of the barons unhappy with his trampling of their traditional rights and customs and generally ignoring them and doing what he wanted to do, as indeed, an emperor might, be accustomed to. I think the laws of Germany, as it were, and the laws of Sicily were not the laws of Outremer. So after his departure, we have a breakdown in the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Cyprus between rival baronial factions that supports the rule of Frederick and his agents that he leaves behind, his imperial agents, and the native barons who want to obviously protect their rights and their traditions and their customs that they feel are being threatened and overlooked. So a civil war erupts, starts on Cyprus, moves to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and most of it is concluded, for the most part, most of the actual violence and heavy fighting and such like actually concluded by 1233, when various fortresses on Cyprus are finally captured. But it goes on ultimately until 1243. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is split for the most part between imperial faction and the baronial faction. In Acre, the city sets itself up as a commune with John of Ibelin, the old Lord of Beirut, at its head as its mayor. And for this 10-year period, you don't have much in the way of actual direct out-and-out violence or anything. There's no major battles occurring between the rival factions again, but there is an awful lot of politicking, and there's a lot of legal wrangling and arguing in the High Court in Jerusalem, in front of the papacy, with the emperor himself, over their various stances and rights, and each side is attempting to gain some sort of advantage, or it's a sort of a Cold War situation, really, where they're not directly confronting each other, but they all are trying to gain influence within the kingdom. And yes, this is sort of a waste of resources, but they are in the middle of one of the longest periods of truce that they've had for quite some time. But the sort of downside of this, of course, is that Frederick himself is absent. Half the kingdom doesn't respect or acknowledge his representatives to act as his regents, or respect them enough to pay them any attention. As a result, you have these sort of various powerful barons and baronial families who control some of the major cities of the coast, places like Beirut, places like Jaffa, getting, as far as the imperial is concerned, a bit too big for their boots. And the gap between the nominal power of the crown and its representatives and that of its most powerful subjects is distinctly reduced in comparison. So that the crown of Jerusalem, the king or its representative, is really much a sort of first amongst equals. And certainly when those representatives are in fact members of the baronage themselves, it doesn't induce other members of the barons to see them as different rather than as being one amongst themselves. So by the end of sort of the 1230s, there's very little violence occurring anymore. There is a lot of tension and rivalry and conflicting objectives and plans and ideas about what should be done and how it should be going about. So there's not much unity. I mean, the saying is that the civil war, the Franks, win. The Franks and the barons of the Latin East win, but on principles. But in doing so, sacrifice their unity as a kingdom.
Yeah. So I guess Frederick's idea was sort of to just incorporate the crown of Jerusalem and the Crusader states in general into part of the Holy Roman Empire, right?
Yeah, he would start off as king of Sicily. He'd become the emperor of of the Holy Roman Empire, emperor of Germany, and he's very much accustomed to doing things in a certain way. He's quite an autocrat, and the general absence of a strong centralized monarchy in the Kingdom of Jerusalem since the latter 12th century, since the decline under Baldwin IV, it certainly made the barons pretty used to a more conservatory sort of system of government, them deciding things amongst themselves and having a say in government. And Frederick is the emperor, and he would do things the way he wants to do. He first sees things unilaterally. When he says, jump, you ask how high. The barons were not accustomed to that sort of thing, and they expected maybe that Frederick would be a relatively absent figure. He's obviously the emperor. He's got a lot of other concerns on his plate rather than just looking at the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But he's got an entire empire to run. But I expected they probably would have thought they'd get a bit more freedom than and involvement in their own affairs than perhaps he was willing to give them. But he installs his own men and his own agents, and obviously normally medieval kings are reliant on negotiating with their baronage to accomplish tasks. You operate through your barons, but when you're the emperor, you have considerable finances and resources at your disposal, where you can, if you really want to, just ignore them.
Yeah. Okay, so this kind of brings us, this sort of sets the stage for what ends up happening at the end of this truce that Frederick had established through the Sixth Crusade. We get to 1239, and that's when this truce expires, and Jerusalem gets retaken fairly quickly by I guess it's an Ayyubid faction, correct? Is that correct?
Yes, and Nasir, who's the ruler of Kerak, which sort of incorporates the Jerusalem area around it.
Okay, yeah. So, but I guess this actually happened. Does this happen before Theobald I of Navarre arrives, or after?
This happens just after. It's one of the sort of reactions to Theobald's arrival and the actions of the troops under his nominal command, anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Barons' Crusade isn't called in response to the fall of Jerusalem. Then
that's something that happens along the way. Gregory IX in 1234, realizing obviously that there's only 4 or 5 years left until the truce ends, and how long and how much effort is required on the part of the papacy and European magnates to organize and promote and a functioning crusade, starts the ball rolling in the mid 1230s with the sort of intention that a crusade be launched around 1239, 1240 when that truce ends.
Okay.
And that launches various preaching and sermon tours and things like that of Latin West, trying to get people to go on crusade, which meets with mixed results because medieval Europe has its own problems in the 1230s. The kings of England and France are bickering. The emperor is at odds with the Pope. So on and so forth. All the usual problems that always get in the way of attempting to organize a crusade for the papacy are once again present.
So what is it that brings Theobald the First of Navarre? I guess he was also the Count of Champagne. What is it that sort of brings him out to the Holy Land?
Well, he is obviously the Count of Champagne, and therefore is the inheritor of a long crusading lineage. Obviously his uncle, Henry II.
Henry, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Henry II had been king of Jerusalem until he fell out of a window and died in 1197. His father, of course, had been one of the instigators of the Fourth Crusade, and he himself had been on the Albigensian Crusade in the 1220s, was at the Siege of Avignon. And of course, he's, by extension, is related to the kings of England and the kings of France, and therefore Richard Lionheart and Philip II. So he's quite a crusading inheritance. So he, responding to the preaching tours that are put forth by Gregory IX and others, takes the cross, along with many other prominent northern French barons, including the Duke of Burgundy, Duke of Brittany, the de Montforts, who, as always, get around everywhere, and leads and along with some troops from Navarre as well, leads an army of around about 1,000 knights. It's expected to be to the Latin East in various contingents. Some go from Marseille, others go from Italian ports, and they all start to collect in Acre in the autumn of 1239.
Okay, and so what does he hope to gain? Like, what's his strategy as he gets into this in the Holy Land?
Well, perhaps he seems to, as a inheritor of this sort of legacy, he wants to establish his own amount of glory and establish his own name within his crusading family, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
But we can presume there's cases that he is moved by the various sermons and the various preaching that to assist the fate of the Holy Land, which is well known that while Jerusalem had been returned, it wasn't completely in Christian hands. It was in precariously located. Its security was it was not secure, and that the Holy Land was still in peril, still at a threat. And he goes, and the intention, of course, is to secure the Holy Land and make it safer, to make it to gain greater access to Jerusalem, to preserve Jerusalem and Frank's presence there. Okay,
so I know there's kind of minimal actual combat that takes place. So what are the military encounters that we see at this point? I know you mentioned that Jerusalem is lost as a result almost of Theobald showing up.
Well, Theobald shows up and once the various troops collect in and around Acre. And after a month or so of gathering in Acre, he sets out with his army of Crusaders and the military orders and the local native baronage, and with some who joined them from Cyprus. And they decide to move south down towards Ascalon and attempt to try and fortify and secure Ascalon and Gaza. In doing so, that would secure the southern borders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and would provide better security and potential access to Jerusalem itself. The borders that had been drawn up after the 1229 agreement with Frederick II were quite unwieldy and quite unmanageable, and the native barons were not happy with them because it was not a practical solution. They were kind of stuck with Jerusalem, but no meaningful way to secure it. And it's decided that after a council that this crusade will go down and focus on Ascalon, which had been destroyed after the Third Crusade, and rebuilt, and then try to move on to Gaza. And doing this, once again, the southern coast of Palestine is secured, and it's another obstacle for any army coming up from Egypt to encounter. And obviously, in the many discussions we've had over the years, the importance of Ascalon to the Kingdom of Jerusalem since the mid-12th century once again comes up. Its importance for its navy, importance for a launching point against Egypt, that sort of thing. So they go down to Ascalon, and as they're marching down there, the Duke of Brittany hears of a caravan, a supply caravan, moving through the Jordan Valley towards Jerusalem, and he decides to go off and attack it with a couple of hundred knights in tow. And there is some fighting, and he is successful, and he brings back a lot of loot and supplies and brings them to Jaffa, where he meets the army, and then they move off towards, and there's lots of celebrations before they move off towards Ascalon. Now, this caravan had been intended for Jerusalem, and the ruler of Jerusalem, who was An-Nasir, was rather angry about this, and so decides to take reprisals against the Jerusalem region. And he launches an army that goes and attacks. This is in November of 1239. Launches an attack against Jerusalem. Jerusalem hadn't been particularly well fortified. The Treaty of 1229 had not permitted for the refortification of the city to take place, and it was only recently that any attempts to give it any fortifications or repair and or improve the fortifications had actually taken place. So the city is largely undefended except for the Tower of David as the fortress and a gate. An-Nasir attacks, and the siege lasts for 27 days until early December, where the small garrison within the Tower of David is basically besieged and just holds out until their supplies run out, and then they negotiate their surrender and hand over the city, at which point An-Nasir destroys the remaining fortifications located within Jerusalem. Jerusalem returns to Muslim control for the time being, and he departs. So that's where this temporary loss of Jerusalem comes from in late 1239. In the meantime, the crusading army on the coast has leaves Jaffa, continues on its way down towards Ascalon, and some of the barons hear of another group of Muslims, another caravan, another party, maybe a reconnaissance force that is gathering around the area of Gaza. So they decide to go off and attack it, despite the military orders and Theobald of Navarre advising against it. They leave in the middle of the night, and cast aspersions against Theobald about his calling cowards and things like that, and head off. This includes some of the native barons, as well as the sort of Duke of Burgundy and the Count of Bar, who go off with several hundred, about 500 knights or so, maybe about 1,000 infantry. The numbers are to be believed, and they head out towards Gaza, where it turns out that the force that they were expecting to find was much, much bigger than they were expecting, and they are surrounded and ambushed, and the native barons advise that they retreat and flee back towards Ascalon, where the main army is now encamped, and most of them do, but the Count of Bar stays behind and is eventually killed, and many of them are taken. Many of the infantry that had gone with them are killed or taken prisoner and taken back to Egypt. At Ascalon, Theobald of Navarre has arrived, and they are refortifying the city when this news arrives. And they think, well, perhaps we should go down and help, but the native barons again inform it it's far too late, and you just be walking into another trap. So, having not thoroughly finished the fortifications of Ascalon, they eventually return back to Acre.
Okay. So, and that, as far as I know, that pretty much summarizes the military action of this crusade, doesn't it?
That is the primary thing. That the Battle of Gaza in sort of November 1239 is the only major thing. They go back to Acre, kick their heels for a little while. There's some movement in force up to Tripoli to try and involve themselves in some of the Ayyubid politics between the emirs of Homs and the emirs of Hama, who are rivals. But as they're moving up north, that resolves itself, so they don't get to do anything there. So they march again back south, but they end up making a deal with the ruler of Damascus, who is worried by the An-Nasir, who's in Kerak, and the rulers of Egypt, that they're going to attack him. So he decides to make a deal with them, with Theobald of Navarre, that he will promise them very large swathes of territory in the Galilee, returning important fortresses at Beaufort and Safed, various other locations, including Jerusalem, which was not his to give, but he could promise it anyway. And if they will assist him in fighting against his Ayyubid rivals in Kerak and Egypt, and this is negotiated by the Templars. And Theobald of Navarre agrees to this, and the army begins to raid and pillage and attack the areas about the Jordan, trying to enforce the agreements that the ruler of Damascus has now made. So there is some more raiding, and there is some more skirmishing, and that occurs in this sort of early period of 1240. But the main conflict that's at the Battle of Gaza is pretty much it.
Okay. So this agreement is made between the Ayyubid ruler of Damascus and Theobald, and that essentially, I mean, you mentioned that Jerusalem wasn't necessarily his to give, but they are able to reestablish control of Jerusalem for the most part, aren't they?
Yeah, they raid around. Obviously, it's not the ruler of Damascus is not his to give Jerusalem away. He doesn't own it. He doesn't control it. That's An-Nasir in Kerak. But since An-Nasir's lands are the ones being raided and attacked, An-Nasir himself starts to come to various agreements with the Crusaders, and he doesn't really gain and lose anything by handing over Jerusalem. It's not fortified anyway, so he quickly makes some concessions, and the various promises that the ruler of Damascus has made start to come into being as the force of the Crusaders can actually just make those promises turn from theory to reality. So that's the thing. I mean, Damascus had been back in the 12th century, been a long time ally for the Crusaders against Egypt and things like that. So again, this is just a sort of replay of the various regional politics of making alliances with local Muslim rulers against other Muslim rulers that had been carried out since the mid 12th century.
Yeah. I think in some ways it kind of demonstrates, I guess it reinforces and maybe even proves to some extent the point of Jerusalem's indefensibility, just in terms of the larger situation. at the end of the Third Crusade, this is the whole reason that Richard focused on consolidating his hold of the coast and didn't make an attempt on Jerusalem. I mean, just in terms of the numbers, I mean, the Ayyubids and the various Muslim powers, they had such overwhelming sort of control of the hinterland, I guess, that it just we can see how Jerusalem is this situation we had after the First Crusade, where they were able to set up these really strong chains of fortification, I guess. Kerak and all that, and it's just.
And these fortifications do exist, but those fortifications that they've set up now since the 1180s, 1187, and everything, are now concentrated very much on the coast, and you get a much more sort of fortress mentality of the Crusaders. That even when they had control of Jerusalem between 1229 and 1239, there were no significant returns of institutions or organizations that had been previously located in Jerusalem and had been exiled for 30, 40 years, returning to Jerusalem again. They're quite content to stay at the coast. And while the Kingdom of Jerusalem is no longer a titular thing for this period of time, the Franks don't seem to have a lot of interest in attempting to retake it or actually incorporate it into their territory, because it's not practical. It'd just be a weight around their necks, even though obviously it's Jerusalem and it's the sort of be all and end all, and for the crusading rhetoric that they have, but it's not a practical thing to do. And I think one of the reasons why there's perhaps less attention paid to the Barons' Crusade and why it doesn't get as much attention is that because Jerusalem is in Christian possession and is not in imminent threat of being captured as it had been in 1187, as it would be in 1244 for the Seventh Crusade and Louis IX. It's one that people aren't perhaps as willing and ready to go out and crusading and join the Barons' Crusade as they would have been in, say, after 1187 in the 1180s and 1190s with Richard I, and as they would be after 1244 with Louis IX. That there's this kind of lack of peril, this lack of the threat that because Jerusalem's in Christian hands, it'll probably be fine. Is the attitude. So only when it's lost is there something to gain. Yeah,
and I think as you mentioned, the way that the barons of Outremer had fortified the coast is really impressive, and I think that the coast was really defensible. I mean, it was kind of a formidable military establishment, I guess you could say. It's almost like that. At the point where in the post First Crusade kingdom, where there had been all this fortification in the hinterland, and Baldwin I and went out kind of close to the Red Sea and set up some castles and stuff. That sort of mentality, like you're saying, had moved kind of exclusively to the coast, or was a lot more concentrated around the coast, I guess you could say.
It's just much more defensible. Yeah. And the Franks had learned from the periods of the Third Crusade and such like that it's easier to defend the coast and move troops and ferry troops around and supply and resupply cities from the coast than it is inland. So, I mean, it's understandable that, they don't want to move inland until opportunity and circumstances make it viable. And I think this is sort of, we get a lot of criticism, or the Franks of the Latins get a lot of criticism by their contemporaries in Europe, in medieval Europe, about, making deals with the Muslims who they're supposed to be crusading against, of course, and how they're reluctant to move away from the coast. And they go, that's just common sort of sense, really. It's in sensible, pragmatic solutions that they're trying to find here, which stand in odds with the more bellicose crusading rhetoric that people are expecting, or certainly the contemporaries are expecting.
Yeah, I guess for Western Europe, there's this ideal that exists, this kind of concept of crusading. And then, for the barons of Outremer who actually live in this territory where, there's this sort of mundane political reality, it's a very different thing. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. That's one thing I think is most interesting about the Barons' Crusade is it sort of points out these two aspects to crusading that, on the one hand, the Crusades are this idea, this sort of ideal of the age, the Holy War. But at the same time, the Crusades are also Outremer. It's this string of this territory that where certain people, certain Latins live, certain Latin barons, this is their livelihood. This is their
This is
bread
sort
and
of
butter.
it's sort of one of the criticisms that the Crusaders, the barons who had come with Theobald of Navarre, the Count of Bar and the Duke of Burgundy, sort of going on about when they decided they wanted to go out and attack this what they thought was going to be a much smaller force at Gaza. They, because that's what they're there to do. That's what they're there, to do, to prosecute holy war, to crusade, to fight their Muslim opponents. And one wonders why the native barons may have gone with them. I mean, you have prominent native barons, Odo de Montbéliard and Balian of Sidon, who are prominent men in the kingdom, had been baileys of the kingdom of Jerusalem. And surely they would not have gone out and been so foolhardy and reckless. But then, if they're only expecting to meet a small force, and they're having a raid in force to further secure the area, then it's perhaps quite reasonable. And it's the Count of Bar who wants to stay behind and fight at the Battle of Gaza, when the native barons are actually advising a retreat, for security purposes, to back towards Ascalon. So I think this idea between the pragmatic solutions of the native baronage trying to get by and figure things out, compared to the more bellicose and rhetoric that the Western Europeans have been brought in on, it does have some grounding. Though how much the truth between the ideas of hawkish Western Europeans and more dove-like native barons is probably too simplistic. But that's the traditional interpretation. But I think that is probably a bit too simplistic for what actually occurs. But there is some merit to it that these things do crop up periodically.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. It's not that the barons of Outremer weren't necessarily dove-like. I guess they were. But they were more familiar with the local politics, the situation, and so perhaps their military decisions were more informed by that. I guess
Yes, and you have of course the military orders on hand as well. So they're going to make the decisions that are hopefully the most appropriate for their context, for their situation, which to Western eyes might not be the same thing, of course.
Yeah. So we've kind of gone over Theobald. He establishes this agreement with Damascus, and he actually is going to be gone from Acre by September of 1240. So I guess he considers, he's taken care of things. I guess is Ascalon mostly refortified at this point, or
Ascalon is partly refortified. I mean, Theobald leaves. But the Duke of Burgundy stays behind to go, to continue fortifying Ascalon. The job's not finished. The problem is Theobald has made these agreements, made this agreement with Damascus, but just before he's sort of about to leave, or when he's thinking of leaving, the Hospitallers start approaching the Egyptians for a separate agreement, to which Theobald then also agrees. Obviously, the ruler of Egypt wanted to break up the alliance that Damascus and the Crusaders had been forming. Obviously, that is a danger to their security, and obviously he wants to deal with Damascus just by itself. So he, again, the ruler of Egypt promises the various lands and confirms the various donations that Damascus had made. Not that he had any right to do that himselself either, but who cares when if you're Crusaders, you're going to win either way by the looks of it. Again, promises return of Jerusalem and the promises to secede all of Ascalon and various parts of southern Palestine. And Theobald agrees to this as well. This causes some dissension between rival groups, as the Templars had brokered one deal and the Hospitallers had brokered another. And the imperial faction was much more oriented towards the Hospitallers and Hospitallers towards them than the barons were towards the Templars. So you have various rivalries playing out, and everyone looks at Theobald and starts blaming Theobald and saying, what have you done? We've broken one agreement and we've started another one, and so on and so forth. So Theobald is not a particularly popular person by the sort of autumn of 1240. And these two agreements are in the air, and he then departs. Having done his bit, he departs. He'd been there for a year and leaves with these two sort of treaties, these two agreements still floating around unconfirmed and whatnot.
Yeah, and the Barons' Crusade continues to be very kind of complicated and maybe unromantic in some sense.
Mm.
Okay, so yeah, Theobald leaves Acre. So the next major personality, I guess, we get for the Barons' Crusade, Richard of Cornwall, who he
Yep.
departs for the Holy Land in June of 1240. So tell me a little bit about Richard of Cornwall and how he sort of wrapped things up, if you will, I guess.
This is Richard of Cornwall. He's the second son of King John. He's the brother of Henry III of England. He's the nephew of Richard the Lionheart, sort of Richard. And he's the Earl of Cornwall. He's sort of one of the most important men in England and one of the leading sort of baronial personalities of Europe at this time. He's the brother-in-law of Frederick II as well.
Okay.
So he's got a pretty pro-imperial faction and sort of sympathies, and he'd come out and he'd had the blessing of Frederick to act as his sort of agent and make decisions on his part and things like that from Frederick when he came out. So he's very much sort of in the imperial camp in this regard. So he comes out, he sets out from England in the summer of 1240 and arrives in the autumn, and arrives that autumn. He's got an army that's probably somewhere in several hundred knights. I think 800 is a sort of number I've seen thrown around. But certain other contingents depart later, and they turn up later in 1241 and things like that. So it doesn't all arrive in one go, but he has got a good number of people with him. And he arrives in Acre, and everything is a bit unstable and chaotic because he arrives a month and a half after Theobald has left. You've got these treaties which haven't gone anywhere. They haven't been advanced. They're all still up in the air. The Templars and Hospitallers are bickering because they've got rival objectives now. And the imperial faction and the baronial factions are also bickering still. And he turns up into this and decides that he's going to set everything to rights basically and fix the problems that had been left by Theobald when he departed. So unlike Theobald, there's no major military actions with Richard. There's no Battle of Gaza, but he does set himself about confirming the treaties that Theobald had set up, but not finished.
Yeah. So, and I guess he gets a little bit more territory added to it. Is that how it plays out? Or
in sort of February, the first couple of months of 1241, he confirms the treaty that he'd made that Theobald had made with Egypt, confirming all of the concessions that Damascus was going to make in that treaty. But he also gets a few more fortresses thrown in. He gets Belvoir, Mount Tabor, and the city of Tiberias and things like that thrown in as well. So more of the Galilee is returned, and he gets Ascalon secured, and he also gets the various prisoners that have been taken at Gaza, the Battle of Gaza the previous year. He gets them released as well, and he goes down to the battlefield and he ensures that all of the people on the battlefield are also buried because they've just been kind of left there for the most part. So he shores up all of the things that Theobald had left unfinished. So there are no battles. There's not much in the way of raiding or conflict, nothing like that. He's got an army, and he even promises to pay any crusade when he arrives in Acre. He'll promise to pay any crusader who turns up or who's in the city to join him. But there's no major fighting or anything like that. Much like his brother-in-law back in 1229, he does all this through negotiations. Although he's got he does have a military force to back him up if needs be. But he finishes all these negotiations, he finishes these treaties, and regains a considerable amount of territory for the Latin East. It's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, it's really interesting how at this point in the history of Outremer, I mean, my impression is, despite kind of the civil infighting and whatnot that we get with the war between Frederick II and the local barons, there's kind of this long period of recovery, and this is sort of we sort of see that coming to fruition almost in the Barons' Crusade, and it's just really remarkable how quickly all of that is lost. But I guess that sort of tells us something about the situation. I mean, there was kind of a precarious quality to these holdings, with the fact that there were quite a few powerful Muslim states, in the vicinity. It's interesting how for the Ayyubids, they seem so totally focused on fighting each other. I mean,
Mm.
you don't get this sense at all that they are offended necessarily. I mean, maybe they are offended by the presence of these Latin states, these Christian states on the coast. It doesn't seem to be much of a priority, though. I mean, what do you think of that,
No,
Dr.
it,
Donnachie?
it, it doesn't. And I don't think they really are a priority for them. And certainly in the first couple of decades of the 13th century, they're not really much of a priority at all for the Ayyubids. The Ayyubids have much bigger issues and their own bigger problems amongst themselves to be dealing with. And yeah, the Crusaders, the Crusader states are still there. The Franks are still there, but they're not posing much in the way of a massive threat. I mean, they only pose a threat when a large crusade turns up and threatens to muck it all up for the Ayyubids, overturn the system or suddenly, be the ringer, and something has to be done about that. And in the Fifth Crusade, that happens, and the Ayyubids normally unite against the external threat of the Fifth Crusade.
For the one time after Saladin's death,
yeah,
the
exactly.
Ayyubids unite.
It's like, exactly, it's like the everyday Franks don't pose much of a threat. And then while there is raiding and there is raiding in force and some both by land and by sea, there are no major conflicts that the native baronage of the are afflicting upon their Muslim neighbours for the most part. It's lots of borderland sort of skirmishing and general low level sort of activities like that. There's no major concerted campaigns to recapture territory, and so as a result, they don't really care too much. And actually, the Franks along the coast are actually really quite useful because they act as a clearinghouse for all of their ships from the Italian merchant cities and things like that. Are clearinghouses for the goods and trade of Damascus and Alexandria. It's actually kind of very beneficial to keep them there. Yes, there's obviously always the touchstone of the rhetoric of jihad, just as there is always the touchstone of the rhetoric of crusade. But the practical solution is that they're not much of a threat isolated along the coast as they are, and they're not causing any trouble. So leave them to it.
Yeah.
They don't pose any major threat to the established order of the Ayyubids at the time. And there are periods of weakness when they, for the most part, they don't need to be looked at, and they occupy very little space in the source material, which is very indicative of that. They're not really viewed with much concern by the Ayyubids for the most part at this time.
Yeah, that's one thing I remember when I was reading Ibn al-Athir's the kind of the third volume in the Ashgate series. It's amazing. This is a from the Chronicles of the Crusades series, and yet there's very little mention of the Crusaders, and it's more of a chronicle of the Ayyubids and their internal issues. But yeah, it's an interesting point too. I mean, I think with the Barons' Crusade and this whole period, it kind of flies in the face maybe of some of the popular, I think when people today, like who are unfamiliar with the Crusades, are sort of presented with the idea of the Crusades, and they get this image in their head maybe of, just really intense conflict between the Muslim and Christian world. Just this, the reality is just so different from that. I mean,
very much so. Yes, yeah. It's easy. I mean, the narrative of of conflicting civilizations, this narrative of an East versus West or Christianity versus Islam, is very simple. It's very basic. It's very easy to understand, but it doesn't represent the kaleidoscope of complex political, overlapping political relationships and webs that exist in the Middle East, exist between the Crusader states and their Muslim neighbors and things like that. It's far more complex than such a narrative as that would permit.
Yeah, and I think that's an idea that's sort of like the clash of the two faiths that exists on both sides. It's a part of the heritage of both, but at the same time, yeah, it's just there are these long stretches of time where it just seems like neither side is too concerned with that, and especially I think when we think about the Ayyubids, they had certainly the advantage in terms of numbers and maybe the wealth and power they wielded. Of course, it was all broken up because they were fighting each other all the time. But if that had been the main priority, if we've got to get rid of these horrible Christians who who they mock us by their very presence, almost this kind of idea.
Mm.
If that had been the idea, then there's probably plenty of times throughout the 13th century when all of the full power of the Ayyubids could have been united for that purpose, but we just don't see that. That's
Indeed.
not how they're thinking. Go ahead.
The difference between the source material, which is steeped in the rhetoric of concepts of holy war, whether that be from within the Muslim world itself, or whether that be from medieval European sources, where the writers are promoting this idea because that's what they're there to promote, versus the actual reality of what's going on the ground. So are two very different things of rhetoric versus reality. And the problem is, if we pay too much attention to the rhetoric, it's very easy to imagine that's what it was always like, and that's how it always was, when in fact simple things like the Barons' Crusade amply demonstrate that no, the Crusaders, even actual Crusaders arriving, as opposed to just the native Franks living in the East, are integral parts of the local political structure and political power plays. Damascus needs the assistance of the Crusaders wants the assistance of the Crusaders, wants the assistance of the Franks, the Latin East, and the Crusaders arrived to make moves against its rivals in Jerusalem, in Kerak and Egypt. And Egypt likewise needs to make deals with them so as to break that alliance, so they don't move against them. And this kind of idea of that the Franks are an important integral part of the local political tapestry comes up again in the 1240s as well, when eventually we have the Battle of La Fourbe, where once again Damascus and Egypt are at war, and the Franks need to be brought in to one side or the other to help assist the matter and sort the matter out. It's easy to assume it's ideas of total war and ideas of consistent conflict between sides that never get on, that they're always locked in war, but they're not. You have a tapestry, this fabric of the local politics, in which the Franks of the Latin East and the Crusader states are as much a cog in that, as much part of that as anything else, as say are the Byzantines, as are the Armenians, as are the different ethnic groups within the Middle East itself. That these things all overlap, and that it's not a conflict just between two sides. That's far too simple, and is obviously nothing like the actual reality that you can see, as the Barons' Crusade kind of points out.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I just kept thinking of when sort of looking at the Barons' Crusade, getting ready for this. So yeah, really interesting stuff. I think this is an overlooked aspect of the Crusades, but it's really helpful in helping us understand the phenomena better and just understand this history better. So yeah, Dr. Donnachie, this has been really a fascinating conversation, and you laid out the Barons' Crusade beautifully. I certainly appreciate that. It was great having your commentary, so thanks for being with us for this.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, this is the Real Crusades History Podcast. I think we've pretty much we've covered everything, don't you think? We've sort of
pretty much. I mean, the only thing I'd say is that we see the sort of 13th century Kingdom of Jerusalem as being quite weak because in a post-Hattin, post-1187 world, but by 1241, the end of the Barons' Crusade, things must look pretty rosy to the Franks by comparison, and that they've regained an awful lot of territory that they'd lost back in 1187. So I think had things maybe worked out differently in the latter part of the 1240s, maybe the Barons' Crusade would have got more attention than it actually does.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I try not to fall into that trap too of thinking, this was just this little coastal sort of enclave kind of holding on to life. Yeah, that's not correct. They had recovered a lot, and this was a considerable state, and as you mentioned, they could take part in so the power plays of the various Muslim factions, the Ayyubid factions. So yeah, I mean, it would be wrong to sort of dismiss the Kingdom of Acre and the Crusader states at this time as just this as totally weak or totally just on the verge of collapse. So
yeah,
very good point. So really interesting discussion. So again, great to have you on, Dr. Donnachie, as always. and we'll have to do it again sometime on another topic.
I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. This has been the Real Crusades History Podcast. We release a new podcast or video every Monday. Thanks for listening with us. Also, don't forget to check out the Real Crusades History blog at realcrusadeshistory.com, where a new blog post is released every week, either by Dr. Helena Schroeder or Rand Brown or another author. So, thanks.